Welcome to the Mindspace podcast. I'm Joe Flanders. Thanks for tuning in. My guest today is Dr. Les Greenberg. Les is a psychologist and a professor emeritus at York University in Toronto. He is one of the creators of emotion-focused therapy and the founder and director of the Emotion-Focused Therapy Clinic, also in Toronto. He provides therapy for individuals, couples, and trains future EFT therapists. He's the author of 17 books, like Changing Emotion with Emotion and Emotion-Focused Counselling in Action. And he's published over 100 scientific papers and has written over 80 book chapters. Emotion-focused therapy, sometimes known as EFT, has become an important part of my psychotherapy practice and that of many of my colleagues at Mindspace. There's something kind of refreshing and powerful about putting emotions at the center of the therapeutic process. Unlike other frameworks like Cognitive Behavioural Therapy, which try to change emotions via other, more accessible aspects of experience. I'm also intrigued by the sort of transformative intention of EFT, again, in contrast to other approaches that aim to sort of help people cope with difficulty or kind of manage symptoms. There's definitely room for both coping style psychotherapy and transformational style psychotherapy. But I've been working as a psychotherapist long enough to recognize that until you go deep and really get into transforming old patterns, the same kinds of reactivity will often keep reemerging throughout your life. So I'm increasingly sold on the importance of doing that deep transformational work. So for all these reasons, it's really, really cool that I get to talk to someone who really has dedicated his entire professional life to developing an approach that is deeply transformational. And he's done a bunch of really rigorous science studying this approach and its effectiveness. So really interesting conversation with Les. We covered a bunch of topics. We talked about the role of emotions in our lives and how they're implicated in mental health problems, how to transform emotions. We talked about chair work, which is really like the essential ingredient to EFT, and how sort of strange or unusual it could be for clients sometimes. We talked about why activating emotional experience is essential in therapy and how the EFT approach is different from other types of other experiential therapies. We also talked about the role of the therapist in EFT and why the therapist has an important role in co-regulation and facilitating the client's self-regulation. So those are some of the highlights, some of the topics we covered. I also just wanted to mention that unfortunately about halfway through the recording, there was a bit of a glitch in my sound gear. And so the second half of the recording is a much lower quality. It doesn't interfere with the listener's ability to understand, but it's maybe a little less aesthetically pleasing. So apologies for that. And so without any further delay, here's my conversation with Dr. Leslie Greenberg. Okay, Dr. Leslie Greenberg, welcome to the Mindspace podcast.
Thank you.
All right, so you and I were just chatting before I hit record here, and I was explaining to you that there are a number of therapists on my team and in my community that are, big fans of emotion-focused therapy and use it, and I use it myself. But not everybody listening will know about you and this innovative approach to psychotherapy. I wonder if you could introduce yourself, how you got into doing the work that you're doing, and tell us a little bit about what emotion-focused therapy is.
Well, I'm now a retired professor, 75 years old, and I've been at this for I haven't actually worked it out, 50 years, I guess. So I'm originally South African, but I've lived in Canada for more than 50 years. And I think the important thing, which I often talk about when I introduce myself, is I used to be an engineer. So I have a master's degree in engineering before I changed into psychology. And the origins really of EFT starts off in my fourth year engineering exam, where I solved a math problem that no one else in the class solved. And I was fascinated with the fact that somehow I knew how to solve the problem or take a path that I didn't know how I knew what I knew. And so I became fascinated with the idea of I know more than I can say. Was reading Polanyi on tacit knowledge and personal knowledge. And this led me into psychology to try to understand this phenomena of knowing more than I could say. And then as I started studying actual therapy, I came to see that emotion was at the source of this kind of gut feeling that guided one in certain directions, so that we have a kind of we're wiser than our intellects alone, and that we know more than we can actually say. And I then sort of shifted my focus into trying to understand emotion. And in 1970, there was hardly anything written about emotion, but I just started reading everything that I could get about emotion. But then I was trained initially as a person-centered, client-centered counselor by a student of Rogers, Laura Rice, who was my mentor at York University. And then she actually introduced me to Gestalt therapy intellectually, not experientially. Most people were introduced to the experiential therapies through personal experience, but I read this book, Gestalt Therapy, Growth and Excitement in the Personality, I think it was called, and I found it fascinating. So I went straight from a master's degree in engineering into a PhD in psychology. I skipped ever doing a course on learning in psychology, and I've never been very impressed with the notion of associationistic learning and so on. And another one of my professors was Juan Pasqualeone, and he was a neo-Piagetian, said to be the only person who really understood Piaget well enough to challenge Piaget from within. So I picked up a Piagetian kind of way of thinking about functioning. Meanwhile, I trained in Gestalt therapy, and I was synthesizing all of this into what became emotion-focused therapy. There was a lot of personal experience as well, in which, I was highly intellectual and mathematical, and so being able to give up control and allow myself to be vulnerable was a major personal journey. And so there was a lot of personal experience that fed into my understanding of the importance of emotion.
Okay. That's a really interesting kind of backstory. I didn't realize how personal it was. I wanted to kind of mention that I first came across and first met you actually, and first came across your work as an undergrad. And I was doing a psychology degree and took a course on psychotherapy. And, we went through the sort of the history of psychotherapy, understanding, psychoanalytic approaches, and then behaviorism, and then, the CBT kind of paradigm shift. And, this was in Toronto where you're a relatively big name. And EFT was sort of introduced to me as, in CBT, we're working with cognitions and behaviors and maybe body sensations to try to affect change in emotions. And EFT says, well, why don't we work directly on the emotions? Does that sort of like historical presentation, does that resonate with how you were designing this thing, or did it really come from a different thread historically?
I think, you see, when I was at graduate school, CBT didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
I read Beck's first book, and, not to be too provocative, I threw it away, thinking this is superficial rubbish. It just doesn't explain human functioning and the depth of human experience and how therapy works. So when I was initially in 1970 to 75 in therapy, the core conditions in Rogers were sort of what were being taught, and they were the things that were studied. So I grew up in a humanistic environment and believed strongly also that people's main motivation is to survive and to thrive. The growth tendency sort of had an appeal. I saw psychoanalysis as much too pathologizing and dark. And basically, I saw behavior therapy and cognitive hadn't yet hit the popular kind of imagination. I saw them as too simplistic. So actually, my first motivation was within the experiential tradition, which was talking about the importance of experiencing. As CBT grew and became this dominant paradigm, I began to feel it was really important to articulate that emotion was more fundamental than cognition or behavior. So then it became the sort of center point of the development. And at first we called emotion-focused therapy, was called process experiential therapy, where the emphasis was on experiencing and on process. But as I studied more and more, I thought it was really important to articulate an academically defensible, intellectually defensible understanding of emotion and its role in change. Neither client-centered therapy nor Gestalt therapy, which were my two original theoretical perspectives, had clear theories of emotion. But also there was this political element that CBT was becoming so dominant, and to my mind it was just not capturing the real understanding of human functioning, where emotion was the sort of primary driver.
I've got a bunch of questions about the experiential aspect of the therapy. I really want to do a deep dive in that. I first wanted to ask you. Oh,
sorry,
it's okay. Take your time.
Phone is ringing. I didn't switch it off. Can we take a break?
Yeah. Go ahead. Take your break. No problem.
Hello. Sorry, it was a junk call. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just turning off my phone, actually.
Great.
Go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, I have a lot of, I want to get into the sort of experiential nature of EFT. But before we do, I wonder if we can just linger a little bit on emotions, just kind of the basics here. I think that for many people, emotions and our emotional life can have this sort of like spooky quality. Emotions can sort of like overwhelm us, overtake us, and we don't always like identify with or associate with our emotions. Maybe we can just do some bakes on those. So what are emotions, and what does it mean to have like a healthy emotional life? How are emotions implicated in mental health problems? And yeah, why don't we start with that?
Yeah, so, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, and I say, and others, I feel, therefore I am. So that I see feeling as the basic datum of existence, right? It's the very first response we have, and it's fundamentally an adaptive system, but it can become maladaptive through traumatic learning. And I think all over the world, people grapple with emotion. In the West, we control emotion. You know, you've articulated some of the things. I'm afraid that the emotions will overwhelm me. In the more Eastern cultures, we distance from emotions in a sort of meditative way. But I believe you have to dive into emotions because emotions give you information. Specifically, they give you information about whether things are going your way or not, whether your needs are being met, and whether your emotions were designed to help you survive. So your most fundamental need is always, is this good for me or is this bad for me? Emotions also give you action tendencies that orient you to the world. So emotion is our fundamental meaning system that orients us to the world. I immediately orient to something as, is it relevant to me? Is it novel? Is it dangerous? And there's a whole meaning-making process that goes on without language. So it's a very fundamental system, and it's an intelligence system or a survival-oriented adaptive system. So it's giving us important information. And then if we have traumatic learning or our emotions are not handled well in our attachment and upbringing experiences, we are going to have difficulties with emotion. The thing is, emotions were originally called passions. Spinoza is one of the people who writes about emotions as passions. And the word passion really comes from to suffer passively or to be a patient. Emotions happen to us automatically. And in the West, particularly with a control-oriented orientation, we don't like things happening to us, so we clamp down on them or we protect ourselves against them for fear that they'll overwhelm us. But it's this clamping down on emotion that's almost more problematic than having emotions that are just too high arousal or too overwhelming. If we could just breathe into them, accept them, tolerate them, and then begin to symbolize them in awareness, we wouldn't be so overwhelmed by them. So I think pathology, and I mean, there's a move now to viewing all disorders as fundamentally based on emotional processing problems. And that can involve too little emotion, too much emotion, but fundamentally, it's about our relationship to our emotions. How do we manage emotions? And when we don't manage them, we start getting into a lot of psychological disorder.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you can provide some examples from clinical work. So what does it look like when someone has traumatic experiences in childhood or their attachment relationships aren't healthily developed or whatever? What happens and what does it look like when someone lands in a therapist's office?
Well, often the core painful emotions are fear, shame, or sadness, right? So let's say you have an abusive father, an alcoholic abusive father. You grow up with a sense of fear, and or maybe the father is very humiliating and shame, and you don't know how to deal with these emotions. There's not a soothing caretaker who helps you both process these emotions, which means sort of understand them, but also feel safe enough that the emotions won't overwhelm you. So, I mean, I'm just working with somebody now who talks about when he was young, the song "I Am a Rock" by Simon and Garfield really, as a 17-year-old, captured. He had to become a rock because he had this very emotionally abusive father. So he builds a protective stance of, I won't feel anything, I don't need anything, because the feelings and needs were never appropriately responded to and comforted. So then you build a disclaiming or a disowning of the emotions. You block off the emotions, but then you develop anxiety symptoms. Whenever you want to give a talk or have to do things in public, there's an anxiety, but that anxiety is a protection against making a fool of yourself, because your father basically made you feel like you were worthless and inadequate. So we have to go back to that core underlying fear and shame and then begin to work with that, not with the anxiety symptom of having anxiety when you give a talk or you are in front of other people. So I don't know if that quite answers the question as you asked it.
Yeah, perfectly. And it opens the door for my next question very nicely, which is to talk about chair work, which, as far as I understand, is really the core sort of mechanism in EFT. Can you explain what that is and how it works and how it can be helpful?
Sure. And I just want to say that, it's chair work within the context of empathic attunement to affect.
Mm-hmm.
That really empathic attunement to affect is the most important piece. And chair work is an assistance to that, but without the empathic attunement. So I talk about you have to have your finger on the emotional pulse always. And we have to see people as dynamic self-organizing systems who are processes moment by moment. They shift states and one emotion follows another emotion. So we're working with a complex dynamic system,
Mm-hmm.
which is a process over time, always changing.
Mm-hmm.
Then chair work is a way of helping deepen into the underlying emotion, because it's a very evocative medium.
Mm-hmm.
It uses both imagery and it uses enactment. So it embodies what you're doing, because you use not only emotional awareness, but also emotional expression.
Mm-hmm.
So it's utilizing a lot more systems than a talking about therapy.
Mm-hmm.
But what we have done is identified a set of in-session emotional problems, emotional processing problems, which we call markers. And the marker is an indicator of an underlying processing difficulty. So you might have a difficulty that you're very self-critical, or you might have a whole lot of unresolved feelings towards a significant other. So when you enter into this kind of state, let's say a self-critical state, you say things in the therapy like, I failed to be a good parent. I'm really not a good spouse. I'm just not good at things. You're in a self-critical process. Then that kind of state, it's a state of mind or an experiential state, means you're working on trying to deal with the self-criticism. It's an opportunity for a particular kind of chair work, which is to have a two-chair dialogue between two aspects of the self-critical aspect and the experiencing aspect. And the chair work is designed to evoke the feelings that come from the self-critical difficulty. So it will eventually, the chair work, by sitting in one chair and criticizing yourself, will evoke the feeling of maybe shame or fear whatever the core painful feeling is. And then this makes this emotion amenable to change, because I think it's acknowledge that you have to feel fear to change fear. You have to feel an emotion to change an emotion. So we're really trying to get to the core painful emotion to make it accessible to new input. And the chair work is designed to help you get to the core problem, the core emotional problem. And then each kind of chair work has a different set of procedures. So when you're dealing with unfinished business with a significant other, you're imagining the other in the empty chair. And this is also designed to evoke episodic memories and to access the core painful emotional memory, and then go through a process of change. So I'm not talking yet about how you change an emotion, but just first how you access it.
Mm-hmm.
It works are very helpful to access these painful emotions.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear more about changing and transforming emotions. Why don't we do that? Can you talk about how emotions change? I've heard you many times describe this process of transforming an emotion with another emotion. Why is that important?
Right. So my contention is that amygdala-based painful emotions like core fear and core shame are impenetrable to reason. You can't reason somebody out of these core painful feelings, because the emotion is a whole embodied experience, and you're organized to run away. You have a sinking feeling in the stomach. It's not produced by cognition. It's produced automatically by the activation of emotion schemes. So we have to find a way to work with these painful emotions. And the best way to change an emotion is with another emotion. Spinoza was the first person to state a principle like this. And he said the only way to change an emotion is with an opposing and stronger emotion. Now, I think this can be thought about in very primitive behavioral terms, that some of the emotions are organized as withdrawal emotions. So in fear, you run away. In shame, you shrink into the ground. Approach emotions like assertive anger or the sadness of grief, you really are moving forward and towards. So if I have a client and I can take them to their core feeling of fear or shame, and they're organized to run away, then I can help activate assertive anger or the sadness in which you cry out for comfort or reach out for the lost object. You can't run away and thrust forward at the same time. So we've now got two opposing action tendencies. And the new action tendency is going to transform the old one. And Hebb, stated the first law of neuropsychology as neurons that fire together, wire together, and continue to fire together. So if you think of the emotion as an emotion scheme, a network that fires, so when you fire shame, and at the same time, simultaneously, you fire off anger. So let's say you have an alcoholic, physically abusive father. When you first imagine him in front of you in an empty chair, it fires off these feelings of fear and shame, and you shrink and you want to run away. But then if I can help you to feel assertively angry, I should have had a father who treated me right, I deserve to not be abused, it generates assertive anger. I'm angry at you for having treated me so unfairly. Now, this new emotion undoes the old emotion. It doesn't replace it. It actually transforms it and synthesizes with it to develop a truly novel experience. So your self-organizing system is reorganizing, and maybe the shame, the anger synthesizes with the shame to produce confidence or security or calm or something new. And this is a developmental process. And rather than thinking of it in learning theory terms like exposure leads to reduction, this actually comes from a Piagetian notion of the development occurs by the synthesis of co-activating schemes. So that's the fundamental idea, but at a more practical level, it's the best way to change an emotion is with another emotion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is, in my experience, so like right on the money in terms of what creates the most profound healing experiences for clients. I don't know if listeners would really have a sense of how this works. When we talk about like empty chair or two chair, like we're actually having clients sit in one chair, say, speak to this other chair directly, and then switch chairs. So this is very like embodied, very unusual way of working, in comparison to other more traditional kind of forms of psychotherapy. And I wonder if you could just say briefly, the clients that I work with are not always super comfortable doing this, right? It's a little weird. It's a little kind of mysterious, and you have to sort of get into this like role play mode. I wonder what your experience has been on kind of explaining the process or helping people ease into it, because it can be quite sort of uncomfortable and emotionally arousing. How do you ease people into the experience?
Right. And it was interesting. In our one research study, we found 2 out of 20 people wouldn't do chair work, but 18 out of 20 would. But there definitely is this awkward, uncomfortable notion. And you really have to see chair work as a kind of social invention, just like asking people to lie down on a couch or even viewing therapy through a one-way mirror. These are all kind of social inventions that may help. But I've identified 3 kinds of people or 3 kinds of personality issues that make it awkward. I mean, one is social anxiety, so people just feel embarrassed about performing and so on. Another one is people who are very high on need for control. It's out of their control to do things, and it evokes experience that they may feel is too dangerous for them. And then there are people who are very fragile, who really need to keep the face of the therapist in mind or in focus all the time because the relationship safety is the most crucial. So it's just interesting to sort of have a differentiated idea of what might be the difficulty. But generally, I introduce it by saying this may seem really weird, and I've done this myself, and I'll help you. So there's a lot of supportive kind of introduction. And then for some people who really don't want to do it, we don't treat this as you are resisting, but that, yeah, it is awkward and there's some reason. So I'll ask you, what's the difficulty for you, and talk about it and be validating of their anxiety. But then also, it's often because it induces anxiety and the shock of it. So often with people like that, I will say, yeah, sure, we won't do that now, but maybe we'll come back to it sometime later. And they've now been introduced to the sort of novelty and shock. But also it depends on the overall alliance. So people have to feel safe, and you've got to give them a rationale if they are feeling awkward about it, so that it makes sense to them until you get agreement. There can be a fair amount of work to eventually get someone into doing a chair dialogue.
You mentioned early on about your background as an engineer, and that always struck me as a really interesting and compelling source of trust that we can bring using the EFT model. Again, because emotions could feel murky, or they can overwhelm us and we lose our sense of control. Knowing that there's engineering built into this model, again, sort of provides the sense of trust. I wonder, how is this whole thing engineered, and how do you think about your engineering background in like the chair work or any of these things you're talking about?
Well, I think I came into psychology with a very different background. So the experiment was, the mainstay of psychology, but not in engineering.
Mm-hmm.
In engineering, we were modeling, observing actual phenomena. So I believed you had to really observe what was going on in how people were changing. So you had to study the actual phenomena and not, as I derisively used to say, ticks on pieces of paper. Psychological measurement I thought was absurd, where you answer questionnaires and you answer questions. So we had to observe actual behavior and the actual performance and then try to model it. So I actually came in with a type of very early AI background, I guess. Had this dream that I would build a computer program that would model the resolution of self-criticism, and that we'd be somehow able to do this. I pretty quickly gave up on that idea because it was very difficult to build emotion into a computational program. I mean, there's a lot of work going on now with where the computer identifies facial expression and can identify. I just saw a program recently where the computer says it felt 95% disgust and 3% fear just from reading facial. But so I started off with some sort of hope of being able to get some understanding of the process of how things happen. So as an engineer, you would watch the flow of a fluid through a nozzle, and you would try to mathematically develop an equation that would model the actual flow, of the fluid. So it was a whole different mindset to studying how things happen. So the first book we wrote, called Patterns of Change, was studying the patterns of change in actual therapy. And that led to these diagrams, which I think, also came from a kind of engineering orientation. So it was an alternative, doing task analyses of analyzing how people solve problems. Was very different to an experimental and statistical kind of comparisons. So I think that's how the influence came.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned also earlier this notion of empathic attunement, that the chair work is one thing, but it has to happen in the container with a therapist who is creating safety and providing a rationale and really kind of present for and a witness of this whole transformational process. I wonder if you can say more about the role of the therapist. I interviewed Sue Johnson, who I believe who's has her emotionally focused couples therapy. I believe it's an adaptation of your work, but you can clarify if it isn't. And I, we talked on in our interview. She claims that all self-regulation, all ways of like working through difficult experiences are co-regulation. So it always involves another person. And, this idea that we could like self-regulate, that we can meditate or we can do, like cognitive restructuring or like, calm ourselves down. These are all like very, very inefficient. And, that they're really just, these little exercises that may have some small impact, but really the way to change is to regulate is to do that through connection with another person. I'm wondering how you see that.
Yeah. So, I mean, firstly, Sue Johnson was a student of mine and worked with me to develop what we called emotionally focused couples therapy, which at that time came out of my sense that disclosing vulnerable emotions to another person helps the dialogue. She then evolved in her own path and became more of an attachment theorist.
Mm-hmm.
So, the notion of co-regulation is central. Well, I believe that there are two possibilities. There's self-regulation and there's co-regulation. And there's no doubt that co-regulation of affect is very important. And that's the one component of my approach to emotion-focused therapy, is that the empathic, soothing other and the collaborative bond are all a very important part of helping people deal with their feelings, but that also there's a more intrapsychic aspect where you can actually soothe yourself as a individual, and that there are certainly self-regulation processes, but I'm not a fan of deliberate self-regulation, sort of learn skills of regulation, but essentially changing emotion with emotion is a form of, I mean, you can call it regulation. I prefer to think of it as transformation, but where one emotion from within can change another emotion. So my approach is a synthesis of both intrapsychic and interpersonal, and that you can influence and transform emotions through relational processes and through intrapsychic processes. But I don't believe that it's that easy to deliberately regulate your emotions to get real change.
Mm-hmm.
They can be used as coping skills, and but you have to go to a more automatic level of processing to get deeper change.
Mm-hmm. Is it? I wonder if I can press this a little bit further. Is it accurate to say that, in your view, again, the therapist is creating a container for the client to do their own intrapsychic work, or is the therapist's role somehow more directly involved in the transformation?
Yeah, I mean, we're sort of quite clear on this, that it's both and,
Mm-hmm.
either or, so that the containing relationship is very important to allow the client to do the work internally, but they are also the relationship of breaking the isolation and of the co-regulation of affect is also going on, and both of those together provide the potency of the treatment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, I want to go like really inside baseball here, kind of um, getting at some of the subtleties, the nuances of how you recommend these transformational processes happen. And I want to kind of contrast chair work and EFT from other kinds of experiential approaches. So, as I think I mentioned to you earlier, the framework that I have the most training in is the sort of mindfulness-based therapies and, mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And this is really borrowing from Buddhist psychology, which recommends that we treat emotions as these like fleeting events in experience, like thoughts. They're, clouds passing through the otherwise blue sky, and we don't attach to them. We don't identify with them. We let them run their course. And so, we might say, for example, we might train someone in a mindfulness-based cognitive therapy to say something like, "Oh, anger is present." Right. So it's
Sorry, anger is?
anger is here. Anger is present. Okay. So it's very sort of disidentified. Okay. So yeah, maybe we can just pause there. I wonder, the way chair work works and the way your model approaches dealing with something like anger would be very different. I wonder if you could speak to how you see that Buddhist view, and just, of course, acknowledging, or I would sort of suggest that there is a long history of sort of the development of wisdom and well-being by adopting this disidentification. There's something interesting or helpful about doing that. I just wonder how you locate that in
Yeah. So, the metaphor I like to use is that the Buddhist view is you sit by the side of the river and you let the emotions float by,
Yes.
and that in EFT we're saying you've got to dive into the river, right, and dive
Yes.
into the emotions, right? Now there are different forms of Buddhism, and some of them have more similarity of actually experiencing the emotion. But as you say, the disidentification is the main thing. So, my view is that if you are truly a Buddhist monk and you can live a total life within a context that supports a meditational approach to dealing with emotions and dealing with life in general, that, this is a kind of almost behavioral way of coping, and can bring wisdom and joy, but it's talking about a way of living,
Mm-hmm.
not a way of therapeutic change. I think as a therapy, it's providing people with coping skills, but not with transformation, unless they commit themselves to a very serious, long-term, 30-year program of a way of being
Mm-hmm.
that allows you to disidentify.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think transformation is quite different to disidentification. And it means, so firstly, you have to have the distinction between primary emotions, secondary emotions, instrumental emotions, adaptive and maladaptive. So if you have anger, we've got to go into the anger, and is it a primary anger at having been violated? I believe, there was this debate between the Dalai Lama and the scientists, the emotion scientists, and eventually he was persuaded, much against his initial position, that anger could be an adaptive emotion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So is it an adaptive response to violation, or is it a secondary emotion that's really a reaction to underlying vulnerable feelings? So we have to sort of understand what the emotion is or how it functions, and we've got to get to the underlying source often when it's reactive, symptomatic anger. So that's a different approach to observing it and letting it arise and pass away.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the theories, what I call the received theories of emotional change, are single mechanism theories, which involve you have the emotion and it somehow goes away, right?
Mm-hmm.
The original theory was catharsis, where you get rid of emotion because it's a byproduct. Then there are processing theories where you process the emotion and it goes away. Detachment theories, you let it come and go. And then habituation theories, you get used to it. And extinction theories, where it no longer has a bad consequence and it goes away. But they're all, you feel it and somehow it goes away. My proposal is you feel it. And I mean, I chased this question for 30 years. How does change happen?
Mm-hmm.
We observe it, that people feel one emotion and then a new emotion emerges. And when the new emotion emerges, it changes the old emotion. And you get a synthesis and a new emotion emerging. So that's quite different to the emotion is felt and goes away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's not acceptance of emotion alone. We do say you have to arrive at a place before you can leave it. So you need to accept the emotion, but that's not enough. You also have to leave it by a transformational process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. In some of my training, I picked up this notion of, I might get the terminology wrong, but the sense that there are some moments in therapy where you need to help the client regulate, kind of contain the emotion, and other moments where you need to deepen or amplify the emotion. And it always struck me that this sort of mindful distance or decentering or disidentification that we're talking about is a really helpful tool for containing. But if we're starting with the assumption that the way to create deeper lasting change is transformation, then we do need to really move into and feel, activate the emotion. So I wonder if the limitation really is there.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand the last part. You're saying, can you repeat? You're saying you do have to feel it in order to regulate?
Yeah.
Sure.
In the EFT framework, if the outcome we're looking for is transformation, then techniques or interventions that contain and regulate might limit the extent that to which you're
I see.
deepening and
Yes.
feeling, and then creating the possibility for transformation.
But you see, you have to have a differentiated conversation of which emotions are we talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So dysregulated emotions that are either outside the zone of tolerance of the client, when it's too much and you can't bring any meaning to the emotion, those need to be down-regulated. But that's still not saying which emotion. Is it secondary emotion? We don't want to promote more secondary emotion. We want to explore into it to get to a more underlying primary emotion. We want you to feel the primary emotion, but that's not usually the emotion you come in with that the modificational traditions are trying to down-regulate, contain, or distance from. So we've got to talk about which emotion.
Mm-hmm.
So your core shame, you don't usually come in with feeling your core shame. You come in with a symptom of being depressed, being hopeless, being helpless, or being anxious, right? So we are not wanting you to feel more anxious and feel it more vividly. We want to validate that you have this painful sense of hopelessness or anxiety, but we want to move through the emotional process to a core underlying emotion. So then we want to get to the shame. Now, we don't want you to sit by the river and watch the shame go by.
Mm-hmm.
We want you to accept the shame, to feel the pain of it, and then this motivates the organism to try to deal with the pain and we help you by looking at what's the unmet need. What do you really need? What does that shame need? That shame needs compassion. It needs validation. It needs recognition of worthiness. And it's that it hasn't had that there's such shame. So once you get to feeling more deserving of the need, this starts to activate new emotional feelings. You start to feel sad that you didn't get the need met, or you feel angry that you didn't get the need met. And then this changes the shame. So I think the important thing and the difficulty in this universal conversation about emotion, because all therapies are saying we deal with emotion, but we mean different things. And one of the key issues is discriminating what kind of emotion are we talking about. And I think the other thing is the difference between a skill training approach, which is teaching you how to cope with an emotion in life, versus in therapy, how do you deal with emotion in therapy in order to help people change that they don't need the coping skill outside of therapy?
Totally, and it has always felt a little awkward trying to squeeze like the round peg into the square hole or whatever, with these Buddhist-based approaches, which are, I don't know, like skills-oriented, as you say, like lifestyle-oriented ways of being, kind of wisdom tradition into a therapeutic context, which has really very different goals, right?
Yes.
So another question about again, sort of the mechanics of working with emotion. I'm starting to understand a little bit more about internal family systems, and there's a really interesting, subtle difference between the experiential work in that frame versus yours. So, in EFT, we have our clients like sit in a chair and then really inhabit the emotion and say, I'm angry at you for not performing in this and that way because we really need to get all this perfect if we're not gonna be, shamed by our loved one or community or whatever. And so you're really speaking from or speaking as this part, this emotion. And
Right.
it's different. The client will be speaking for a part, for one of their parts. So this angry part wants to say X, Y, or Z. I wonder, like, just how you think about that, and why you think it's important for the client to really speak from the emotion.
You see, the reflective position comes from the conceptual processing system, the narrative system. The experiential system is an automatic, pre-linguistic, affective, bodily-based system, and it has its own neuronal wiring, and we are trying to work with that. So that's why you have to embody and speak from the actual experience. This is what it means to be experiential. It's not to step back and talk about it. So, the very early distinction in experiential therapy was the difference between talking about versus experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, it's not fresh in my memory, the internal family systems, but I remember reading it because there's often references, but I know I was not taken with it as being the same as EFT. I think what you're saying is you sort of talk about the different parts as opposed to embody the different parts. And I think when you embody something, there's a different brain process that goes on in the embodiment. And we're trying to work with that automatic system rather than the reflections on that system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Again, I'm not a huge expert in IFS, but there is this sense in which the parts are with you in the room and you name them and you acknowledge them, and they really do feel like they're there. So it's experiential in that sense. But uh, I agree with you that there is something different about moving into that chair and really speaking as if the emotion was the sort of reified personality or person with its own motivations and its own needs and this and that. And just it strikes me that just that process of embodying the emotion can be really can generate a lot of insight for clients. That's what I've seen, even before any transformational work happens.
Sure. I mean, we'd have to look more closely at each method to really talk about it and understand it.
I'm mindful of the time here. We're well over an hour. I wonder, maybe one final question: what's happening in the EFT community or in the field right now? What are there innovations kind of being researched right now in the literature, or where do you see this going?
Well, there's still a lot. The main thing that's going on is still trying to get acknowledged as an establishment-based therapy.
Right.
Incorporated into the mainstream. So, I mean, there are some studies. I mean, there's the whole evidence-based treatment difficulty, although that is slowly changing, I think. But so there's some studies going on to try to just provide evidence. I'm not a strong believer that randomized clinical trials are the gold standard, but it's a political rhetoric that's necessary. I mean, we're trying to develop really a second or third generation of emotion-focused therapists. I'm 75 and retired, and I'm not doing any more research. So there's the main efforts that are going on are international trainings.
Mm-hmm.
For there are 40 or so institutes around the world that we've developed. I spend the majority of my time doing training. I just completed a book that's about to come out called Changing Emotion with Emotion. So in a way, I'm focused on trying to get emotion work integrated within the field. So I'm not a strong believer in brand name therapies and in school-based wars, but I think it's really important to try to influence the field towards helping people view emotion in a more differentiated way and how to help people work with emotion and eventually transcend school boundaries. And there's some work on sort of applying to different populations. Like we don't really have work on addictions that's been really studied. So there's just there's no specific sort of developmental innovations going on.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the book. When is that going to be published?
It's currently, in its last steps of production. So I'm sure it'll come out in June or soon. That's an American APA. I publish mostly through American Psychological Association. So that's called, the title I think is Changing Emotion with Emotion. And I think a leading edge is sort of actually making more training videos.
Mm-hmm.
I think videos are one of the most powerful ways of actually conveying what it is we're talking about. Because people have these views, even in reading books, you develop certain views
Mm-hmm.
of what it is, but you have to see the actual thing to begin to understand it more closely. And I guess that ties into that EFT was developed by studying first audio tapes and then videotapes, studying the actual performances. And then you write about it, which is an abstraction. So watching videos is one of the best things to do. There are a number of videos with the American Psychological Association and also with a British group called the Counselling channel. They have good videos, and they're cheaper than the APA ones.
Mm-hmm.
So those are good resources for learning.
Mm-hmm. Where could people find this stuff? So the trainings, the videos, the book, is this stuff available online somewhere?
Yes, I mean, if you Google it, you should find it. But there's a International Society of Emotion Focused Therapy. That's ISEFT, ISEFT.org. So that would be a good place to go to, and there you should find resources that are available. I do a training, and we do many trainings all around the world, but I do a training through York University, accessible through emotionfocusedclinic.org.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a variety of trainings going on around the world. And of course, with the virtual, but we train experientially, and we have, to our pleasant surprise, found that even doing virtual experiential work works quite well.
Mm-hmm. 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 Anything else that you want to mention in terms of stuff that you're working on, or even anything that you felt we should have covered in our conversation?
No, I'm good with what we've covered.
Okay.
You?
No, I'm really good. I just want to make sure that I'm respecting your time here, so we can wind this down. Once again, thank you so much for doing this. Really, really enjoyed our conversation, and hope to do this again sometime soon.
Right. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
All right. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Mindspace podcast. I hope it was inspiring. If you feel the world could use a little more Mindspace, please consider supporting the podcast. The best way to do that is to leave a review on the Apple Podcast app or wherever you listen, or share your favorite episode on social media. Thanks, and be well.